Hi, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Pete Eberle, and I'm with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society. For those of you who are new, CRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a statewide nonpartisan 501c3 that is supported by our sustaining individual and business members, as well as donation. You can sign up for our newsletters, find our social media links, and become a member or donor at www.cres-energy.org, CRES-energy.org. Also make sure to visit our YouTube channel where we have over 200 previously recorded videos that have garnered about 1.3 million views so far. And before we get started with Andres, I have a couple quick announcements on upcoming events. On Wednesday, April 12th, 7 p.m., it will feature air source heat pumps for radiant heating in cold climate with Hans Joachim Price of BrightSense. This will be a webinar. And on Thursday, April the 20th, 7 p.m., we will have the rescheduling of Going Mostly Car Free is Easier Than You Think with Robbie and David Millis, who will share ideas and lessons about their journey from a car-centered to a mostly car-free lifestyle. Again, you can find information on these events at cres-energy.org. If you're signed up for our newsletter, you'll get a notice there. And if you're signed up for Meetup announcements, we also announce through Meetup. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it off the virtual mic to Andres Restrepo, Senior Attorney with the Sierra Club's Environmental Law Program. Andres.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. And thank you everybody for coming. It's really great to be here and to be able to discuss these interesting issues with you all. So I'm going to be talking today a little bit about the West Virginia v. EPA case from last year. I want to give you an overview first of just the electric sector, what it's looking like today, how it's changed in recent years, how it relates to this question of greenhouse gas regulation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the laws that are in place at the federal level for doing that, what led up to the West Virginia v. EPA decision, what was it about, what did it say, and then I'm going to talk about what are we looking at going forward, both at the federal level after that Supreme Court decision and at the state and local levels as well. All right, so the electric sector, it has changed rather dramatically in the last decade. In 2013, at the utility scale, about 39% of electric generation was from coal-fired power plants, 27% was from gas, 19% from nuclear facilities, about 7% from hydropower, and about 6% from non-hydro renewables like wind and solar. That was what we were looking at about a decade ago. Today, at the utility scale, we see about 17% of generation so far this year from coal-fired units. That's less than half of a decade ago. 40% natural gas, 20% nuclear, 7% hydro, so those are the same, and then about 15% non-hydro renewables like wind and solar compared to 6% a decade ago. And then there's a little bit of oil and petroleum, a couple of other things that are about 1%. So it's, to me, really remarkable that as much as 42% of our current electricity generation is now non-emitting. There has been truly remarkable and impressive growth in renewables just in that time. Utility scale wind has grown by a factor of close to 3, and utility scale solar by a factor of close to 20. So you might say, well, 20, I mean, you went from 6% non-hydro renewables to 15%. That's because a decade ago, there was very, very little actual utility scale solar. And now there is a considerable amount, and it's really been a remarkable growth. So despite these efforts, huge quantities of greenhouse gases are still emitted by the sector. It remains the largest stationary source of greenhouse gases in the United States. It was the biggest overall source, not just stationary source, but overall source up until a few years ago when it was overtaken by the transportation sector, largely as a result of the movement away from some of the CO2 intensive generation options like coal and towards things like renewables. Today, electricity generation accounts for about a third of all US CO2 emissions, and our country is rapidly expending its remaining carbon budget for remaining under 2 degrees of warming, which is considered to be the threshold for avoiding runaway climate impacts. And the fact is we just can't stay within our carbon budget and meet our international climate commitments without seriously and extremely rapidly stepping up our efforts to decarbonize the electric grid. Okay, so where does the law play into this? So the Federal Clean Air Act is our nation's primary legal tool at the national level for fighting air pollution. It has been an immeasurable success at improving public health and the environment, at saving lives, and at making our nation a better place to live. I consider it up there with things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Social Security Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and other landmark legislation that has improved the health and welfare of our country. The major pieces of this law were first put into place in 1970, and it is worth noting with 0 no votes in the Senate and 1 no vote in the House of Representatives. I mean, this is a major regulatory program that passed with almost complete unanimity, and major subsequent amendments were passed in 1977 and 1990, which were enacted with similarly huge bipartisan majorities. So it really goes to show that environmental protection and clean air has been a truly bipartisan issue, and there's no reason why it can't be again. So this statute includes, the Clean Air Act includes multiple important programs, and some of those I'll describe in a little bit more detail as we go on. So even though climate change was recognized in the early 1970s, actually, as a phenomenon that we had to deal with, it wasn't until the Supreme Court case Massachusetts v. EPA in 2007, in which it was firmly established as a legal matter that the Clean Air Act's general definition of air pollutant included greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. Now, these, in contrast to conventional pollutants are things like we think of like ozone, particulate matter, mercury, things that have a direct impact on human health when they're inhaled, that they exist in the ambient air and they're directly impact human health. Things like greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, on the other hand, they don't actually have a direct impact on public health. I mean, if you're in a room and there's nothing but CO2, you'll choke, but it doesn't have the same sort of effect on the lungs or on cardiovascular system like ozone or particulate matter would. But the problem, of course, is that it drives climate change, which in turn does have massive health and other impacts. So the question was, is this a pollutant within the meaning of the Clean Air Act? So the George W. Bush administration had initially rejected a petition from Massachusetts, Sierra Club, and other organizations asking EPA to regulate greenhouse gases from mobile sources. But the Bush administration declined on the grounds that they believed the statute simply didn't extend to greenhouse gases. So this went up to the Supreme Court, and the court disagreed. They held no, in fact, this definition of air pollutant in the statute is broad enough to encompass greenhouse gases. And so because of that, EPA was required to evaluate and really take a look at these greenhouse gases to determine whether or not, in fact, they caused or contributed substantially to dangerous air pollution. In the context of mobile sources was that case, but it extended beyond that to things like power plants. So after Mass v. EPA, again, that was 2007, it took EPA another 2 years to formally determine that greenhouse gases did in fact endanger public health and welfare by driving climate change. And this is what opened the door to actual regulations. But to give you an idea of just how long these things take to be issued, that was 2009. The first electric sector greenhouse gas regulations were not issued until 2015 for existing power plants. That year, the Obama administration issued standards for both new and existing coal and gas plants. So that was a 6-year gap. And yet the existing source standards, the rule you've probably heard of called the Clean Power Plan, those were suspended by the Supreme Court. The legal effect was put on hold pretty soon after that, in early 2016, as a result of a legal challenge. Now that was ultimately repealed by the Trump administration, which believed, no, we actually don't have authority under this particular section of the Clean Air Act to do what the Obama administration had done. And there was no actual, the litigation was not finalized, it was still pending, and yet the Trump administration repealed it. They replaced it with the so-called Affordable Clean Energy Rule in 2019, which was also legally challenged, including by my organization, Sierra Club, and others, which was essentially a rule that did virtually nothing to reduce power plant emissions. That was rejected by the DC Circuit. They agreed with our position, and then it went up to the Supreme Court. Okay, so that's a lot going on there. So where we are today, the Supreme Court held in West Virginia v. EPA that, in fact, the Obama position was not legitimate, and I'll talk about all that stuff, so don't worry. So just to give you a sense of where we are, we're 15 years after Massachusetts v. EPA. There still are no regulations for CO2 for existing coal and gas plants on the books. There are new source standards, which have been on the books since 2015. Those were challenged, but they were not rejected, and the litigation there is on ice. Those don't matter as much, to be honest, because at least for coal plants, no new coal plants are currently being built and haven't been built in the last decade. So those standards are somewhat moot. Now, new gas plants are being built, but the 2015 standards do very little, essentially nothing, to reduce greenhouse gases. They're very, very lax. And so Sierra Club and other organizations are really pushing the Biden administration to issue tight new requirements for greenhouse gases from existing gas plants. We're expecting to see a regulatory proposal from EPA probably within the next month or so, along with new rules for existing coal and possibly existing gas plants as well. So stay on the lookout for that. Okay, so why is this also controversial? What is this case about? So let me take a step back and tell you about the specific section of the Clean Air Act that we're dealing with. That is Section 111. So Section 111 concerns standards of performance for stationary source categories like power plants, refineries, aluminum facilities, oil and gas operations, and so on. Once EPA determines that a particular source category causes or contributes to air pollution that endangers public health and welfare, it is obligated to issue and then periodically update standards of performance for new sources. And these standards of performance just mean pollution limits from pollutants that are emitted by those facilities, expressed as a maximum rate, concentration, or quantity that facility can emit. So for instance, if a new gas plant emits nitrogen oxides, and that's the kind of pollutant, they have to issue a standard for the total amount of nitrogen oxides that a new gas plant can emit. So once EPA has issued new source standards under this program, under Section 111, it then has to issue existing source emission guidelines. And so as opposed to the earlier regulations, which only cover new or modified sources, these existing source guidelines cover facilities that have already been constructed. There are some important legal wrinkles here. The existing source guidelines don't apply to all pollutants. Only a certain classes of pollutants can be regulated as to the existing sources, but that includes greenhouse gases. That's what's important to know here. So if there's a rule on the books under Section 111 for greenhouse gases from new sources in a category like power plants, then the agency has to adopt existing source guidelines as well. Now, the new and existing source provisions of Section 111 have some important differences. Namely, states play a role in the existing source regulations, but not so much in the new source regulations. But both provisions operate according to the same legal standard, which is called the best system of emission reduction. So what happens is EPA, for both new sources and existing sources, EPA evaluates the different methods for reducing a given pollutant from that source category. It looks at all of the different ways that you can reduce pollution, and then it determines what it considers to be the best system of emission reduction, taking into account various factors like the quantity of emission reductions that system can achieve, the cost of that system, whether it's been adequately demonstrated, can't be some sort of Star Trek technology, whether it's achievable, and so on. And so then the agency establishes, they figure out what is the actual degree of emission limitation, a number that it can associate with this particular system that it's designated. And then sources have to achieve that number. So rather than EPA saying, okay, sources have to install this particular technology, what they'll do is they'll say sources have to meet this numerical emission limit for X, Y, and Z pollutants that reflect the application of that system. And if the sources are able to meet that same limit through other systems, they can do that, but they have to meet the same numerical standard. So the reason this is complicated or controversial for the power sector is because the best and cheapest and most efficient way to reduce greenhouse gases from coal and gas plants is not actually by installing technology on the end of the plant. It's by simply running those units less often and running renewable energy like wind and solar more. This is how utilities already reduce the emissions from their generation portfolios. It's a cheaper and more sensible way to simply retire a coal plant and replace it with a new solar plant rather than put a very expensive carbon capture and sequestration device on the end of the coal plant. So in light of this, the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, which I mentioned earlier, that was their 2015 regulation that governed existing coal and gas plants. It included as a central feature of the best system of emission reduction for existing fossil plants, the concept of generation shifting. So the idea is that existing coal and gas plants would shift some of their electricity generation towards renewable energy. And this would be reflected in a very complex system of tradable emission reduction credits that would account mathematically for this process, and there was a weighted formula. It was pretty complicated. But the main reason this was controversial is because opponents of the rule said no. Okay, under Section 111, the system of emission reduction, it's limited to things that can be implemented to or at each facility. Something like a bolt-on pollution control device that you put on the end of the stack, not a grid level management strategy. And this is something that, you know, was a pretty big legal fight. You know, my organization, Sierra Club, was very much on the other side. We strongly supported this. So this is really the basis for a lot of the legal challenges. It went through various cases at the lower level, but ultimately it reached the Supreme Court in West Virginia, the EPA. So turning to that decision, what did the court say there? So the fundamental holding of West Virginia was this. The court held that Section 111D, that's the provision that deals with existing sources of the Clean Air Act, does not permit grid level generation shifting as an element of that best system of emission reduction for existing power plants. In other words, the Clean Power Plan was unlawful. Now, the thing that's a little confusing about this case is some people have interpreted this to mean that EPA can no longer regulate CO2 from power plants or CO2 at all or greenhouse gases. That's not the case. The court did not disturb Massachusetts v. EPA. They didn't even say the EPA can't use 111 to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants. They said this particular strategy was not lawful. And one of the things that is also a little strange about it is the court did not outright hold that the only permitted emission reduction strategies under Section 111 are those that can apply to or at each individual source. They didn't say that. Instead, what they said, they decided the question on a pretty controversial, and I know I've used that word a lot, but there's a lot of controversy here, but a controversial and in my personal opinion, a pretty wrong-headed legal principle known as the major questions doctrine. Now, it's a little bit legalistic, but this is actually really important to understand. The major questions doctrine is a legal rule, and it tells courts basically when a court is reviewing a regulation by a government agency that will impose vast economic or political consequences and that represents a transformative expansion of the agency's authority compared to what it has asserted in the past, the court will only uphold that agency regulation if it can find explicit authorization from Congress in the governing law. So this really flips the traditional rule of legal interpretation on its head. Normally, courts will look to the plain text of the statute and see whether the agency's interpretation is a reasonable one based on the text, the history, the structure, etc. If it's reasonable, the court will uphold it. They don't need explicit, crystal clear authorization saying, oh, and by the way, you can do generation shifting in Section 111. But what this principle says is if the rule is too big and important and has too big of consequences, then unless it has that explicit authorization, unmistakable language, the court will reject it. So, see, we have a lot of criticisms of this holding, you know, not the least of which was this. The Trump administration's repeal of the Clean Power Plan, that was what was actually being reviewed, not the Clean Power Plan itself, but the Trump administration's repeal of it. That concluded that the Clean Power Plan would have imposed zero costs and provided zero emission reduction benefits to society. Now, why is that? Okay, the reason is that after 2015, that's when the Clean Power Plan was finalized, the electric sector moved so rapidly away from coal and towards lower and zero emitting alternatives like wind and solar that by 2019, the market had already achieved the nationwide emission reductions on its own that the Clean Power Plan had been projected to achieve by 2030. So in other words, even in the absence of any regulations, remember, this rule never took effect, the Clean Power Plan was superseded by market forces 11 years ahead of schedule. And yet despite that, the court just ignored that. They said, no, this would have had vast economic and political consequences based upon initial projections, even though those projections were wrong. So that's just one criticism I have. There's really many, but the upshot, what we really need to take away from this case in terms of what it means on the ground is that renewables are off the table for the purposes of this regulation. EPA cannot look at renewables or generation shifting as an element of the best system of emission reduction. Instead, they can only consider things that will allow existing coal and gas plants to run more cleanly, not to run less often or to allow themselves to be displaced by wind and solar. So what does that leave us? Under Section 111, that there's a couple of options that remain now that generation shifting is off the table. And I just want to, caveat. So I'm here, speaking in my personal capacity. Some of these are some pretty controversial options, and there's a lot of dispute about whether they're good ideas or not. Sierra Club, we haven't seen a rule. As I said, we're going to see a proposal probably in the next month or so. And, I have no preliminary judgments as to how we'll react to it, but we do have some concerns about some of these, but I'll just tell you what the different options are. Okay, carbon capture and sequestration is probably something you've heard of. This is essentially, it's essentially a scrubber for carbon. It's a pollution control that captures through an amine solution. It captures CO2 after it's combusted, but before it leaves the facility. It takes that CO2 and sends it to pipelines, and then something is done with it. Either it's injected underground, sometimes it can be used for enhanced oil recovery or other sorts of purposes. Now, this is extremely controversial. I mean, I can tell you that Sierra Club is very concerned about CCS, and at least in the context of retrofits at existing coal plants, and it's something that we will generally oppose on the ground. We would always rather retire a plant than see it retrofitted with CCS, but that is something that can significantly reduce the stacked carbon from a power plant. Another option is gas co-firing at coal plants. This means if you've got a unit that normally fires coal, you can put a certain amount of gas into that instead, and so you have a mixture of coal and gas. Because gas burns much more cleanly than coal, you end up having a lower emission rate. Another problem here, though, is that it's very inefficient to burn gas in the kind of unit that burns coal, because it's essentially a boiler. It's a lot less efficient than using a traditional gas combustion turbine, but that's one potential option. Another set of options are what would be called heat rate improvements. These are essentially technological fixes, equipment upgrades, operation and maintenance practices that can improve the efficiency of an individual plant. And we've done analysis, and there is a reasonable amount of additional emission reductions that can be achieved by heat rate improvements. In and of themselves, though, it's really not enough to get the kind of emission reductions we need. You can't really tinker around the edges. You need more than that. Hydrogen is something that you may all have heard of. Again, I mean, obviously you've heard of hydrogen, but as an option here, hydrogen does not emit CO2 when it's combusted. It just emits water vapor. So that's something that is sometimes discussed. It's very costly and energy intensive to create hydrogen. There's a lot of concerns about combustibility. It burns at a high temperature, which means other sorts of pollutants like nitrogen oxides are still emitted. But it's something that EPA may at least be thinking about, probably not as a regulatory requirement, but something that eventually it may incorporate into these regulations. And then one last issue I want to mention is specifically for gas combustion turbines. So there's two types of gas combustion turbines. There's simple cycle units, which is just a basic combustion turbine that produces electricity by burning gas and turning a turbine. And then there's combined cycle units, which have that simple cycle or that initial combustion turbine, but it captures the waste heat to generate steam. And then you have an additional steam turbine that has additional electricity. So combined cycle units are generally bigger. They're a lot more efficient. You create more electricity at a lower emission rate than simple cycle turbines. You often see simple cycles operating for peaking purposes, for when electricity demand is the highest. That's how they're really supposed to be used, but a lot of utilities run them a lot more often than that. So limiting the use of simple cycle turbines to peaking purposes only and requiring combined cycle for more heavy use and for base load or intermediate load applications, that would go a long way towards reducing emissions. So these are just some of the options that we're looking at. But those are all options under 111, and I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that the Clean Air Act really has a whole suite of measures that gets at a lot of different kinds of pollutants. And there are a lot of Clean Air Act rules and even rules under other environmental statutes like the Clean Water Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that we support Sierra Club and that really could be used to improve public health at power plants. So some examples of this would be the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule, which is under Section 112 of the Clean Air Act. That reduces hazardous pollutants like mercury from coal plants. Something called the Good Neighbor Rule, which is a regulation that EPA has just recently updated that is meant to cut down on cross-state transfers of air pollution. Their facilities will emit pollutant that migrates to other states and damages air quality in other states. So this regulation is meant to limit power plant, require basically further emission reduction controls to limit cross-state air pollution, and ozone in particular. There's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter and ozone. These are just the limits on the total amount that can be in the atmosphere. The Biden administration has proposed to tighten the PM standards. They haven't done that for ozone, but doing so would be a huge win for public health and would crack down on some of these facilities. There's regional haze regulations that basically prevent obstructions to visibility in wilderness areas and in national parks. Those can require technological upgrades that will reduce emissions. There's limitations on effluents under the Clean Water Act from power plants to discharge into waters. There's rules about coal ash, and then finally there's permitting requirements for new sources that require the best available control technology. Now, with the exception of that last one, the best available control technology issue, none of these can actually get directly at carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases from power plants. But they will put significant pressure on power plants, all the while significantly improving public health to the extent that we have strong regulations. So I'm not advocating that EPA say smuggle greenhouse gas regulations into the law by way of public health regulations, but we believe that these standards and protections are justified in and of themselves. They're badly needed to safeguard public health in its own right. And we know that taken together and in concert with the greenhouse gas regulations, these will really force a dirty industry to start to pay for all of the hidden costs that imposes on society, but that the free market simply can't capture. So in economic terms, these regulations require those sources to internalize their externalities. And that will really go a long way towards stripping these facilities and the fossil fuel industry of an invisible subsidy that they essentially already receive. So the last thing I want to touch down on is, this is all federal. Well, what about state and local? So these really are important. I mean, under our current legal system, states have the primary responsibility for deciding the energy mix within their borders. Now, Congress certainly has constitutional authority to manage the grid nationally, but they have the power under the Interstate Commerce Clause to do that, but they haven't for the most part. So it's really states are the ones that decide the energy mix within their borders. And the Clean Air Act specifically preserves state authority to enact more stringent environmental standards, at least for stationary sources like power plants, than EPA's. So a state can go beyond and more protective than what EPA has done, but they can't. Any state standards that are less stringent are simply superseded by federal law. Now, some states have bound their own hands and they won't allow their regulatory bodies to issue more protective standards than what EPA has done. But for those states that haven't done that, they really can go above and beyond what EPA has done. In states also, they're free to be as protective as they want because of that. They can ban fossil fuels and mandate renewables, and many have enacted renewable portfolio standards and establish a year by which the electric sector in the state has to be 100% renewable. As I understand it, Colorado has done this with Excel. Although the definition of renewable in these cases may be complicated, but that's another thing that states can do is really ramping up their efforts to impose tighter renewable portfolio standards. And even just short of those things, state public utility commissions that govern utilities currently take into account, they make their decisions normally based on cost and reliability. And this already provides a huge advantage to renewable energy. Today, a new solar facility is cheaper to build and operate than it is to even maintain an existing coal plant in 99% of the cases analyzed. I mean, that's just a no-brainer. New solar is also cheaper than new and existing gas. A Guggenheim report from last October found that utility scale solar is now about a third cheaper than gas-fired power, and onshore wind is about 44% less expensive. So simply by, not even necessarily putting an environmental indicator in this, by simply looking at what's the best bet for consumers, in many or most cases, renewable energies win out. So these public utility commissions are really tremendous forums for doing advocacy. The Sierra Club has done a huge amount of work over the last 15 years in these. It's a lot of attention goes to federal law, and necessarily so, but there's still a huge amount to be done at public utility commissions, and it's really been hugely advantageous to our campaigns. These are also a great forums for organizing, for politics, for really getting people involved in this fight. So that's kind of where the landscape is now. I know that's a lot of information to throw all at you, but I hope that this has been at least somewhat illuminating. And I think, Peter, if we want to turn it over to questions and see if anyone's interested, I'm happy to do that now.
Okay, sounds great. I know we've got a couple in the queue here. Considering that, and I think you might have already answered this, but considering that CO2 emissions come alongside other non-climate pollutants, can the EPA use those other pollutants to regulate power plants and ramp them down?
Yeah, and that was obviously absolutely yes. And again, it's one of the things that you'll find is EPA is sometimes careful not to sort of talk about these things too much, or not to emphasize too much the co-benefits of reducing carbon when you have regulations to reduce things like nitrogen oxides or mercury, because they have to sell these to the public and to the courts on the grounds that they're intended, right? So they've got to, if they're going to be having a rule that reduces nitrogen oxides, they have to show that it's justified from a nitrogen oxide standpoint. And so they don't want to sell, they don't want to make it like this is wink and a nudge. This is really a climate rule, not really a public health rule. But that's essentially a strategy that we strongly support. It has to be a broad multi-pollutant approach that really utilizes all of the tools in the Clean Air Act. And so yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Do any of these rules look at the entire supply chain, such as the leakage of methane upstream from the power plant, or are they only looking at the power plant site pollution?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. In and of themselves, most of them they are kind of segmented out. So for instance, the methane issue, methane is controlled separately under the same provisions we've been talking about, Section 111B and Section 111D. And that's another issue I work on, and EPA is also working on updated and more stringent standards for methane, which I should say Colorado, as a lot of you probably know, is one of the leading states that even before EPA ever took action, Colorado took action to limit methane emissions from its own oil and gas sector. And that kind of helped pave the way for EPA to have the kind of political headway to do that. It's, one of the things that I think is interesting is I mentioned before the prevention of significant deterioration. That's the permitting program for new sources. And there's language in there that could be interpreted to require a broader environmental review before permits are granted to new facilities like new gas plants. Not every new facility qualifies for this, but for those that would qualify, that are above a certain pollutant threshold, I think there's a case to be made that a broader look at the supply chain really might be appropriate in that context. It's something that's kind of an untested legal theory, but I think that especially as new gas ramps up, we need to find ways of saying, look, we need to look at this holistically. And so that's one opportunity to do that. But on the whole, there isn't as much of the full supply chain look. That's why we try to, at least in our advocacy, we try to work on things like, what's happening at the oil and gas sites upstream, what's happening with those methane leaks, where is this stuff going to, what are we doing with LNG facilities, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's I think that there's maybe some opportunities to explore. It's not traditionally how it's done, but it's certainly an important way to be thinking about this problem.
Would that be kind of a pulling in NEPA to the situation?
Well, so NEPA, we've literally, the thing that I just described, the prevention of significant deterioration provisions at issue, it's 165A2 of the Clean Air Act. It's kind of modeled on NEPA. Normally, anything that's done under the Clean Air Act is not actually subject to NEPA, which is, for those of you who don't know, this is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is generally requires environmental impact statements for major federal actions that could significantly affect the environment. So for instance, just an example, if the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission authorizes a new natural gas pipeline, that's usually going to be the kind of thing that requires a full environmental impact statement. And EIS, as we call it, it doesn't have any substantive hooks in the sense that it doesn't force FERC to either accept or reject that project, but they do have to do a full-scale analysis of all of the kinds of issues there. So under anything that happens that the government does pursuant to the Clean Air Act, whether it's permitting a new plant or it's issuing new ambient air quality standards, those are exempt from NEPA. But this thing that I was just talking about under the PSD, or Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program, it's a NEPA-like provision in permitting that hasn't really been used that much, but that we really think needs to start being used more. So NEPA is really a good analogy to think about, at least with regard to that provision.
Great. Okay. Would it be fair to say that the change in the market after the Clean Power Plan and before 2019 had largely to do with the utilities expecting the plan to take effect and not simply market forces?
Yeah, I think so. When I say market forces, I think I guess really what I just meant was not an actual command and control regulation on the ground. But I do think that not just the Clean Power Plan itself, but just the awareness that regulations are coming, the awareness that both at the state level, that renewable portfolio standards are coming, that existing source regulations are on the books. That's true. I think that definitely did drive some of what's going on here. So this is not to say that this stuff isn't important or that regulatory pressure isn't important. On the contrary, this is what I spend all my time doing, is increasing regulatory pressure. I think the main thing that we need to know of is that, the elements are there for a rapid transition, but it needs to move a lot faster. But yes, without a doubt, utilities include what's called a shadow carbon price into their decision making. That means they actually, even though there isn't currently a price on carbon, they don't actually have to pay for their carbon. They sort of understand that over the long term, they will have to in some way or another. And so they incorporate that into their decision making. So yeah, the market signals that are sent through things like regulations, even to the extent that that never got enacted, I think it was important. So it wasn't a totally futile rule. I think more than anything, it just showed us that the pace for the renewable transition, the opportunity for a much more rapid transition than we realized in 2015 is there, and that's what we need to take advantage of.
Great. Well, I'm going to throw in just 2 cents from my side.
Yeah,
There's a number of folks from a local coalition up here that has been doing a little bit of dancing with Platte River Power Authority, and they've adopted a really good goal, but we're not sure if they're going to stick to it. But they often have cited, the potential for carbon taxation or regulation, just the uncertainty. And when you're looking at decades-long investment returns, the risk is really a lot to force them to at least move in the right direction.
Yeah, without a doubt. And and one thing, getting to the issue of supply chains earlier, one of the things I think is really important to think about is that, like, especially to the extent that we have global supply chains. And yes, we do obviously have a lot of natural gas in the United States, but we still import some, and we do have liquefied natural gas import and export terminals, and we do have other sorts of, like, to the extent that we export that, other countries will also be imposing regulations, carbon prices and CO2 regulations and so on. And so if you realize a company has a long supply chain that extends into other countries, particularly those that are interested in taking stronger climate action, that is going to have an impact here. And just to sort of a little bit of an aside, that one thing that you all may or may not have been following at all is that Securities and Exchanges Commission has proposed a regulation that would require companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, their climate impacts, their transition plans, any internal governance issues they have with regard to climate transition. It's not an environmental regulation, it's a financial regulation. But the idea here is that these sorts of things, like large emissions from a company, are going to be a financial, and are now a financial liability that investors should know about. And one thing that Sierra Club has been very strongly involved in is preserving what are called requirements for Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions refer to those that are upstream or downstream in a value chain of a company. And those are often essentially hidden from view. Like, the public doesn't, it's not easy. You can look at a company's own emissions if they have facilities that burn coal, or you can see that would be Scope 1 emissions, or if they purchase energy from certain companies, those are easier to find. But those Scope 3 emissions that really go up and down the value chain are a lot harder to know, and they can also be the ones that present significant vulnerability, especially if they're in places of the world that are going to experience significant physical climate risks. So I just kind of wanted to circle back, because I think that the question about supply chains really gets at an important issue that the law as of now is, in a lot of ways, has in the past not really been reflective of, but that I think that as we go forward, we should really try to focus more and more on bringing that full life cycle view into the picture.
Okay, great. And I agree. In my days in DC, I got involved in LCI, what was called then, life cycle inventory.
Sure.
Okay. Well, here's another, just more of a comment. apparently we're getting a F grade in air quality by the American Lung Association, with the bulk of that coming from our local oil and gas extraction. So the rules we put into place haven't quite hit home yet. But
no, and I hope that the methane regulations are really going to make a difference there. So the methane is another pollutant. It's a greenhouse gas that is not in and of itself. It does accelerate the formation of ozone in the atmosphere, but when oil and gas is extracted from the ground, it's emitted in addition to methane, there's significant quantities of volatile organic compounds and also hazardous hazardous air pollutants like carcinogens like xylene and benzene and formaldehyde. These are, thus far, most of the controls that have existed have been for for new sources. The EPA regulations now, that they have had since 2016 new source regulations, but the Biden administration is currently in the process of issuing rules for existing sources as well. And because, as I mentioned before, the existing source component of Section 111, it is a more complicated thing that takes state processes into account. So the state government is given an opportunity to develop an implementation plan that actually is the thing that is directly enforceable on the ground. That has to be consistent with EPA's guidelines. That's going to take a couple of years, but I do very much hope that in places like Colorado, I know the Front Range does have significantly elevated levels of ozone. I do hope that those regulations benefit the state, that has been a significant player. And I hope that, I'm not sure how the cross-state rule comes into play, but I think that, it's certainly a reason why, we have to look at this not just from the climate standpoint, not just from the public health angle, but to really see these things as part and parcel of the same process.
Great. Regardless of regulation, are there indications that coal mining is suffering and will impact energy supply and price and make the decision for all of us? That is, without abundant and cheap low sulfur coal, what does our energy future look like irrespective of the policy?
Yeah, I think, yes. I think everybody realizes that just coal's days are very much numbered. I think in large part, one of the reasons why it's still around, like, yes, gas, if you're looking at coal versus gas, there are things that can sometimes give the coal people an argument that, look, when gas supplies are short, when we have weather spikes and things get really cold and we need to use so much gas for heating purposes, that's why we need coal. But I think the reality is this stuff is just not economically viable at this point. As I mentioned before, it's cheaper to build a new solar plant than it is to maintain an existing coal plant in every place in the country. So yeah, I think that just that, and just the pressure from all of these other regulations, not just GHG regulations, but mercury, all of that sort of stuff. I guess the question was in the absence of regulation. So just setting that aside, the fundamental economics of where these other competitors are next to coal really means that I just don't think it's going to be around for a heck of a lot longer. There's political forces that protect that in states for which there's lots of jobs. But I think I read somewhere that Arby's, the fast food restaurant, employs more people than the coal industry. So I don't say this to shed light on the fact that there are people whose families have worked in generations at coal plants and in coal mining. Yes, there's states for which they see it as an important part of their heritage, but the fact of the matter is, like, they're not being served well by their governments. If they're basically being led to believe that they will continue to do this indefinitely, that's not in the best interest of those communities. What is finding alternatives, finding new industries, hopefully finding renewable industries that they can work in. This is where things are going. Horses, like horse-drawn carriages, were once a major industry. The Teamsters were the reason they're called Teamsters is because there were teams of horses. The Teamsters obviously still exist. They're just not using horses and buggies anymore. They've transitioned to other kinds of automobiles, and hopefully we'll be seeing electric big rigs at some point. But anyway, my point is that yes, I think that even distinct from the CO2 and greenhouse gas regulations we're seeing, just the economics of it means that I think we're going to see less and less coal, and hopefully I mean, our position at Sierra Club is we'd like to see it pretty much done as quickly as possible, because it's just not, we cannot avoid the worst impacts of climate change and protect our public health without doing so.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm just going to add a little point to that, being that I grew up in St. Louis, home of Peabody and Arch Coal, two of the largest coal companies, who both, I believe, restructured or went through bankruptcy. And it's hard to think of a coal company in the last 10 years that hasn't restructured. And if they weren't allowed to go bankrupt, they wouldn't be in business, you know. So I think that is pretty good writing on the wall. You know, the other thing when it comes to, you know, here in Colorado, especially up in Craig and Hayden, which have mine-to-mouth coal plants that are going to shut down early, you know, there is a transition, but, you know, it's important to remember those plants had a limited lifespan. When those mines were done, I mean, they were going to close in the next 20 years, and now they're going to close in the next 10. You know, those mines weren't going to be forever, you know, and as with all resource extraction, it's sort of, it seems long in our point of view, but it's really pretty temporal.
It's resource extraction is definitionally, you know, time limited. And that's really why the right thing is not to delay that process unnecessarily, but to come up with a smart, just, and equitable transition. And that's what, you know, that's what we advocate.
Yep, and that's, I think we're doing pretty good on that here in Colorado. I know there's a lot of plans. So, any other questions from the group? Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap it up here. So, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So, well, Andres, I want to thank you again for a great presentation, a lot of information, and a pretty heavy topic, but I'm definitely, I feel very refreshed and not as despondent. I think when that ruling came out, it really kind of, a lot of people felt it was a bit of a gut punch, but
yeah,
you know, the market's moving in the right direction. And
yeah, it was a gut punch. Like, I'm not gonna lie. Like, it was definitely, you know, those of us who worked on the case, I was Sierra Club's lead attorney on that case. I mean, there were many lawyers involved in it. It was definitely, you know, a gut punch. We were not surprised. We knew pretty much what the outcome was going to be based upon how the arguments had gone and the nature of the court and so on. But, you know, I think that our strategy at Sierra Club, which is a little different from some of our NGO peers, we really have had our eggs in a lot of different baskets for a long time. And that's why I really want to emphasize the Public Utility Commission angle here, because there's been the transition that has occurred across the country away from coal towards some of these, you know, towards renewables. It's not just one thing. It has been federal regulations, but it's also been state PUC decisions. It's also been just technological advances in renewables. It has been subsidies from the federal government, you know, which were obviously extended significantly by the investment or the Inflation Reduction Act. There's just a lot of different things that have helped, you know, lead that process along. So you know, yeah, like, there's definitely, you know, the way the court ruled this major questions doctrine, I should just say, like, I know that was like a legalistic discussion, but you will be seeing more and more of this idea in more cases. It's already been used. Just last year alone, the Center for Disease Control's eviction moratorium, the vaccine/mask mandate from OSHA, and this Section 111 rule, those were all decided at the Supreme Court on major questions grounds. And the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program, that's also likely going to be decided on major questions grounds. So basically, this doctrine that virtually did not exist all that long ago is now popping up in a way that it really is being weaponized against public health and safety regulations. So do I feel despondent about that? I feel very, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't want to say despondent. I definitely feel like we have a huge challenge ahead of us in terms of, you know, and this is about agency regulations. It's not about what Congress can do. It's about how the executive branch can interpret congressional laws. It's going to be a challenge, and hopefully, you know, there's going to be a limit on how much courts are willing to deploy it, but it does make these fights a lot more salient. So, you know, it stretches into other areas beyond just the environment, and that's why you know, even though it's pretty legalistic, I wanted to touch upon it.
Okay, great. Well, Thanks again. It's been a really educating experience, and I know everyone enjoyed it. And I'll let you go to everyone's evening. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And thanks again to Andres.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night.